Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Hi, everybody. This is the second part of my conversation with Neil Morrison, Group HR Director at the British water company Severn Trent. We get into DEI and the law, how staff networks have suffered from mission creep, and why we're seeing some rather iffy DEI trainers being invited into large organisations who you might think would know better. Little bit of a trigger warning. There are quite a few shocking moments in this conversation, I think, so prepare for some strong feelings to come up. It might be particularly challenging for those who've been on the receiving end of bad practice from DEI professionals within your own workplace. I'm afraid that for various reasons, there wasn't time for me to dig into those moments as much as I would have liked to during the actual conversation with Neil. But they were kind of bugging me, and I thought they'd probably be bugging you too. So in the second half of this episode, I brought in my friend Levi Pay for a sort of post-match analysis, which I hope you'll find scratches at least some of those itches. If you missed the previous chunk of this conversation, it's in episode 6, where Neil talks about why DEI started and where it seems to have drifted away from its original aim of making workforces more productive. And in the next episode, episode 8, Neil and I will talk about whether DEI professionals are starting to behave too much like activists and whether we're about to see the DEI industry shrink significantly, which all sounds rather ominous. Just one more thing to remember. If you're a senior HR professional with a sensible, centrist viewpoint and you'd like to connect with others who share a similar perspective, do get in touch with me via LinkedIn. I'm hopeful that we can help each other to find solutions to the challenges that we're facing around these issues and to help you all get things back on track. Okay, I'll stop talking now and let you listen to the episode. Here is the second half of my interview with Neil Morrison, Group HR Director at Severn Trent. Okay, let's go on to talk about DEI and the law, because I think one of the most visible signs that something has gone awry is the increase in the number of DEI-related cases making it into employment tribunals, and the fact that quite often the employees are actually winning against big employers. So I would say notable cases I've seen recently were Lloyds Banking Group. There was one with Thames Valley Police, and then there's been, I think, a couple with the Open University. So these, to me, even as a non-trained person, would say these look like, when the details come out in the press, these look like quite basic mistakes which are happening within big organisations who you might think would know better, frankly. And they seem to be exposing quite an alarming level of what some people think is capture, what other people might think is just ineptitude or a lack of attention to detail. But it looks a little bit like we're seeing a picture painted of teams which are led too much by their own political views and their assessment of who is the most marginalised in any situation, particularly in a dispute situation. What do you think has gone wrong here? And do enough DEI and HR people understand the Equality Act, even in the most sort of basic sense? For example, I think a lot of people think mistakenly think there's some sort of hierarchy of protected characteristics. And also mistakes being made around positive action and positive discrimination. But I don't know, do you have an idea of what percentage of HR and DEI people, there may be two different percentages there, could give us a clear and accurate summary of the Equality Act and how it should work?
God, I'd say it was a very low percentage, a very, very low percentage. But I kind of...
How low? Go on, give us a guess.
Who could give you a clear definition? I think probably less than 10% would be my guess.
Less than 10%? Well, HR people or DEI people?
But so you're asking about the act itself. You're not asking about kind of how you apply that. So I guess I'm being very binary about saying how many people could quote to you the act itself and the language and what it would be a very small amount. I think, just coming back to what you were saying, Tanya, I think one of the things to watch out on this, because, and then I'll answer, we've got to be careful that the things that get reported tend to be the sensationalist cases rather than the really boring ones. So if an employee makes a claim and the organisation wins, it's very rarely in the newspaper, right? So if the organisation loses, it's pretty much always in the newspaper. So there's a bit of kind of media bias in that to start with. But I think the heart of what you're asking about, I think, is quite problematic. It's a lack of common sense in the way in which people are applying policy in relation to diversity and inclusion issues. And I think that's a nervousness that comes from that they worry that if they're not seen to be hard or acting fast or decisively on things, that in some way that's going to be problematic in their organisation. And it's not just on EDI. This is often, one of my big frustrations about a lot of the work that we do. People go, if we don't do that, we're going to set a precedent that X, Y, and Z, and A, B, and C, rather than taking a step back and going, what's the law? What's the facts? What's the reality? What's the best way through this? And when you look at those high-profile cases, and I've looked at 2 or 3 of them, and I read them, and I just think, at what point did they not sit back and go, this is only heading in one direction here? Is this the direction that we want it to go in? Or actually, should we take a different view? And I think it's that kind of pragmatism that the law tries to encourage, but unfortunately people then interpret it into policy that says things like zero tolerance or what have you, that then leads them to make decisions that then get ruled unlawful because they've not taken a reasonable approach, which is what most employment law looks at, is reasonableness.
Mm. And so what sort of training do people get, HR people and DEI people particularly, do they get in how the law works and how the law should be applied, what it actually says and how it should be applied?
So in organisations like mine, because we're bigger, we have teams of people who do know the law and the legislation, and they'll work with our external lawyers or our internal lawyers to make sure our policies are up to date and they reflect the right way of going. But they also have a experience and a pragmatism about how you apply things so that they feel confident in taking the law and the situation and combining the two. There will also be a lot of people in my team who probably wouldn't even know the Act exists because the policies that they apply or the processes that they apply have been designed to incorporate those as it goes, so they don't need to, if you like. I think the kind of high-profile cases are often, in my view, like I say, where I think just policy has been badly applied without much thought. I'd be surprised, to answer your question, if many D&I specialists were deeply knowledgeable of the law. I think some definitely will be, but it tends to be, certainly in my experience, kind of our employee relations teams and people who sit in that world who understand that, because that's the nature of the jobs that they do.
Okay. And it does seem to come down sometimes to which group they personally feel is most marginalised in some of the cases that I'm seeing anyway. I think that seems to be the read, in which case it doesn't seem like there's an appreciation, for example, of the protections around religion, for example, and I don't know, I just see that ignored a little bit too much, I think. But
I think that's I think that's really fair, and I think it's maybe not a belief in which are more important. It could just be an ignorance of the factors to consider, and sometimes, and this is, as someone who's smacked their head on every branch in the wood, sometimes these cases come to the people who could give the right level of judgment and insight way too late when too much damage has been done. And so I think one of the things that we should all be trying to do is raise awareness in organisations that if you're dealing with something that might be a D&I issue, then you should get support and advice and expertise very quickly rather than wait until it's later on. And so it's almost, I suppose I don't want everybody to be a car mechanic, but I do need people to know when to take the car into the garage. And I guess that's what I mean about there'll be fewer people who know it in depth, but I need everybody to know when it might fall under that.
I think if we're thinking about it, sort of, a lot of these disputes seem to have come about because nobody thought about the law when they were planning the initiative or the workshop or whatever it was that went wrong. And there is this, so I don't think, it feels to me like people don't even think that, it doesn't cross their mind there might be a legal issue, that any sort of feel-good DEI fun event might actually be discriminatory or could set you up for a case with somebody who's not loving it as much as everybody else. The people with the unfashionable views, I would say, tend to also be marginalised. Unfashionable views might come under protected characteristics such as religion and belief particularly, but those people just seem to be cast aside because, I don't know, there seems to be too much kind of homogeneity within the DEI teams themselves sometimes. Do you think that, so there's, we talked about the zero tolerance idea, and I think that's what seems to be what went wrong for Lloyds Banking Group. The use of a particularly racially charged word resulted in a chap being, I don't know if he was, I think he was dismissed. Turned out he was dyslexic, so there was a neurodiversity issue there, and the circumstances of that case, as I understand it, the court said actually Lloyds had a bunch of other options available to them before they went for zero tolerance and got rid of him, which would have been reasonable. But that's probably quite a good example of, I think, zero tolerance. And this idea of kind of going above and beyond the law has sort of sneaked in somewhere as being a great idea. My understanding from the lawyers is, no, you want to go to the law, not over the law. You want to get it right within the law, and that's it. Don't go any further. Because if you're going further, there's a chance you're discriminating against somebody else by trying to be really nice to somebody.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that's right. I mean, I read that particular case that you're talking about, and that's one where reading it as a professional, I'm sitting thinking, how did you end up where you ended up? It doesn't feel like the right kind of thinking and checks and balance had gone on, and there were a whole range of different options. And as I say, it comes back to that concept of reasonableness. But I think that the reaction was to a word which, in that particular case, which lots of people find very, very offensive, but they hadn't taken the context in which it was said and why it might have been said, and I think that's where the judgment will always be: was it in a range of reasonable responses? And I think if you're then going into social policy, which is the bit that takes you beyond the law, because you're going in and dictating what organisations and people in them should maybe think or say, then you've got to be slightly careful that you're not, as you say, falling foul of the law with a different group of employees.
Do you see much discussion about these employment tribunals? Because I see very little on LinkedIn, and I wondered whether you knew, are HR and DEI people actually paying attention and learning lessons from these? Are they talking about them privately, even if they're not talking about them publicly?
So people will be paying attention. My teams will be paying attention. They'll be looking at it, looking at whether they need to adapt. I mean, I think, most organisations of any size will have employment lawyers who'll provide a case law briefing to them on a regular basis, so they'll see those and they'll see the implications of those. I just think you probably hang out in the wrong circles on LinkedIn. If you hung out with the lawyers, then there'd be loads of employment law chat. But I don't think it would be HRDs. It wouldn't be people like myself necessarily. It would be people in my team saying, we've looked at this. I think where they are interesting for people like myself and people in D&I roles is not necessarily in the case law, but in the reading of the case itself and reflecting back, could I see that happening here? because the case law will be determined by lawyers and what that means in terms of policy, various other bits and bobs. I think it gets a bit niche. But I think where they're great is when you read them and you go, "Ooh, I could see that happening here. So what do I need to do differently to make sure that that doesn't happen here?" And that's the leadership responsibility, I think.
Okay. All right, let's move on to talk about staff networks, also known as employee resource groups. So I think their concerns are growing that these have become too political with possibly overt kind of activist agendas, and that they're no longer representative of the breadth of views that they're supposed to represent. I'm probably going to do another episode on them in more detail at another point, but I just wanted to touch on what staff networks are, why they were started, and whether you agree that something's gone a bit funny here. I think they seem to be directly inputting into policy now, often without real legal expertise. Is that correct? Is it mission creep?
It can be. It can be. So I think you can understand the logic of why they started to be formed. Was an idea of, rather than being seen to be patronising, and leaders who might have all been, for example, predominantly white or predominantly male, saying, "We'll decide what's right." There's kind of like, well, why don't we get a group of employees together who can help advise us on the things we need to do and why we need to do it? So intention, tick, good. But I think the difficulty with that is that if that then starts to determine what your policy should be, as you say, or what your processes should be, or how they should be, or starting to step beyond support, then I think that's problematic. And I genuinely think that having groups of employees who come together to support one another because they have a similar experience in life, whether that's veterans, for example, coming together, or whether that's people who are neurodiverse coming together to talk about their experience of going through a diagnosis or whatever. I think all of that is super, super, super positive. I think when it gets into internal campaigning for change, and this is what you've seen in a couple of high-profile organisations where they've ended up being pitted against their workforce, then that's problematic, and that is definitely mission creep.
Okay, I'm sure we'll come back to that one. I wanted to ask you also about the government's Inclusion at Work report, which came out in March 2024. One of the main conclusions was that DEI seems to have wandered way too far from the data, and a lot of initiatives are either ineffective or sometimes even making things worse, and sort of how that's been allowed to happen. Presumably you read that report. I didn't see very much conversation about it. Do you think people read it? Did people take note of it? And what was the reaction to the charge that there hasn't been enough data and the evidence, we've wandered too far from the evidence?
So I think this is a classic example of a good report being caught up in the culture wars, if I'm totally honest. So because the government was conservative, because it came out of an individual, it was under an individual's remit who's been quite outspoken about these. I think in a lot of cases it was written off without people actually reading the content of the report itself, because it was associated with a particular person and a particular regime. And actually, when you read it, it's broadly everything that we've been talking about over the last little while, which is, ultimately, what does the evidence say? What does your organisation need? What's the data? How do you improve things based on what your organisation needs and what the data tells you you've got? And that's pretty common sense for anything. But I think it's kind of too easy, unfortunately, when people get polarised like this, to say anything that comes from this side must be wrong, or anything that comes from that side must be wrong, rather than, they've got a really good point on that, but I don't agree with them on the other three things, or they've got a really good point on that, but I don't agree with those on those two things. I mean, that's what business leaders do on a daily basis. So it shouldn't be any different for diversity and inclusion.
Okay, and it doesn't seem like policies are being sort of stress tested properly, and I don't know. I actually thought the whole thing was a bit. I mean, it wasn't even anti-DEI actually. The whole people that had
No.
actually read it, and there was the kind of Cammy Badnock, let's just say it, effect. A lot of people don't like her. A lot of people do like her, but there was that kind of effect. But it actually wasn't even anti-DEI. It just said, "Come on, guys, this needs to be evidence-based. What are we doing here?" Which I thought felt reasonable.
And I think that comes back to the conversation we were having earlier. At the heart of this is we all want to make things better. We just differ in how we think the right way to do that is. And what that report was saying, as you're right, was saying, I don't think a lot of these things are based on any evidence. And if they're not based on evidence and they're not measurable, then we've got to take them with a pinch of salt, whether they are actually making things better or whether they're making things worse, in which case, that is really problematic for us all.
Indeed. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was training. External training particularly. There seems to be very little quality control when it comes to choosing external trainers, particularly within DEI, and sort of planning sessions. You're getting some people with quite strong kind of personal political views coming in, presenting quite contested ideas as fact and rubbing people up the wrong way. I think the people that love those sessions are the people that give the feedback. People that don't love the sessions just keep quiet and just want to get out of there and get the train home. There doesn't seem to be any kind of oversight around this. Are people just getting their friends in, or is it just, what is the selection process around picking external providers like that?
Yeah, so I think, it's not dissimilar to a lot of, if you like, soft skills training. Right? There's a whole industry of leadership and management training that's going on without very little evidence of showing any sort of organisational improvement on the back of it. I think what you saw here was a lot of people, a lot of sole traders, a lot of smaller organisations pivoted overnight to suddenly becoming specialists on diversity and inclusion training without any real track record. And you saw a lot of organisations panicking, thinking, oh my God, we've got to go out and we've got to procure something really, really quickly, but not being clear about what they wanted to get from it and what they wanted to achieve from it and how they were going to measure it and why it was important. So, I mean, is there any quality assurance? No. Does that mean people are necessarily bad? No. Does it mean that the responsibility is on the procurer to be really clear what they want, what they don't want, and what's going to work in their organisation and measure it? Yes, I think it should. And, business people are business people. If you feel the latest wave and trend is diversity and inclusion, then people will move into that space because that's, how they make money. And I think it's down to the procurer to really, really stress test whether they're actually getting what they want from it.
Okay, so we'll leave the conversation with Neil there for today. There'll be more in the next episode, episode 8. But I wanted to go through a little bit about what Neil said. I found some of it a little triggering, I have to say, and I wonder whether quite a few people listening might have had the same experience. So I've invited my friend Levi Pay to join for this. Levi has EDI experience, particularly within the university sector, has worked at Stonewall, has worked at the Scottish Parliament as well. So I wanted to get him in. He's less of a sort of corporate experience like Neil, but bringing a different perspective. Thank you for joining, Levi. Tell me what you thought of that conversation that we just heard from Neil.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think it was a really refreshing take, I have to say. It's not often you hear someone at that level of an organisation talking, I guess, so calmly and confidently about these kinds of issues these days. I find that, often the conversations are a bit more prickly and a bit more defensive. And I think it's really clear in the way he talks about it that the culture he instills at Severn Trent is probably a really solid, great culture on these issues. I think he was spot on when it comes to where DEI has lost its way and how it's been misinterpreted and how people have gone above and beyond in ways that aren't helpful. So I thought overall it was a really containing discussion that is the kind of discussion we need to be having more of, I think.
I agree. I don't know how typical he is. I mean, he said he said previously that he's probably a bit more experienced than lots of people in that role, and he's worked at lots of different organisations, which again might have given him that depth. I wonder if slightly because, and I don't think we should penalise him for this because he does a good job at Severn Trent, let's not give him a hard time, but I wonder whether he's maybe not aware of how bad things have got at other organisations. So, but I think it's really good as an example of possibly how things should be running. We've now got a bit of a blueprint of a sensible person explaining how things should be going, and so then we can compare that with what we think is happening kind of elsewhere and where it might be going wrong. I'd like to just highlight a few points that he made particularly about that bit to do with DEI and the law, the first piece that we discussed. I found it quite surprising that he said that DEI people didn't seem to understand the Equality Act at all, didn't seem to know about it. In some cases, didn't even know it existed. That was a bit of a moment, I thought, when he said less than 10% of people. I mean, to be fair, I did say, he said, when I asked what percentage could give a clear and accurate summary of the Equality Act and how it should work, he said, I'd say it was a very low percentage, very, very low percentage. And then he clarified, he said, but could give you a clear definition? I think it's probably less than 10% would be my guess. But you're asking about the Act itself, not how to apply that. And he made this distinction between understanding the law and being able to apply policy. And he seemed to sort of say that he doesn't think DEI people need to understand the law or even need to know it exists in some cases. What their job is to apply policy that has been written, and the policy should be in line with the law. Therefore, the people applying the policy shouldn't need to know the law. Was that what you understood as well?
It's what I understood. I'm not sure I agreed with him on that point. I feel that kind of decoupling of DEI practice from the law is exactly what's led us into the problematic waters that we're in at the moment. So I think you're right to pick up on it. I think your surprise showed in your face when he said the 10% figure. And I think that I would probably go even lower than that in my experience of working with DEI teams, to be honest. If what you're asking for is a really cogent explanation of the legal concepts and the boundaries of those concepts, I would say that's incredibly rare to come by. And I would name the DEI practitioners who have that. I would number them on one hand, I think, to be honest. And that is a real worry. When I was a practitioner myself, in various organisations, the Scottish Parliament you mentioned, and then latterly a university, one of the things I did every single year was attend really in-depth legal updates. So 1 or 2 day conferences about case law, emerging case law, upcoming changes to the statute, and I was surrounded by lawyers. And I wasn't a lawyer, but I wanted to immerse myself in that world. So because I saw it as my job to translate what was happening legally into practice. And if you don't see that as your role, and you see your role as doing things that are more, I guess, sort of more promotional or more kind of practical, the risk starts to creep in that you start pick and choosing pet projects, you start prioritising some issues over others, you start being guided by external organisations that have their own agendas around fundraising or, promotional activities, and you become kind of, you're no longer anchored to anything. I think that's the risk.
Yeah, I mean, my background's in journalism, and journalists definitely understand media law. But as a kind of background, it's not their job to do that, but you need it as background because you need to think, oh, hang on a minute, this sounds like that might be a legal issue. A little alarm bell needs to go off. And I think the problem with DEI people is that there is no alarm bell because they don't know when they're running into trouble. That's what isn't really kicking in. I think it was interesting that he talked about the sort of this possibly being fear-based. So I think I challenged him on whether part of what was going on was that they were using their own beliefs about who was most marginalised, particularly in a dispute situation. That some of the DEI people were using their own personal feelings, their own personal politics, possibly to decide who they believe in a dispute situation is the most marginalised. So I gave him quite a hard time on that. But then he said he thought it might be more fear-based, which I thought was interesting. He said, I think it's a lack of common sense in the way in which people are applying policy in relation to diversity and inclusion issues. And I think that's a nervousness that comes from that. I think that's a nervousness that comes from that they worry that if they're not seen to be hard or acting fast or decisively on things, that in some way that's going to be problematic in their organisation. And then he went on to talk about the fear of setting precedents and things like that. So I wondered whether that was something, I mean, I just hadn't thought about that before, that they are fear, it's coming from a place of fear, partly in some cases. I'm not sure about all of them, but that might be part of it.
I think the key bit of what he said there, I think, is we need to be seen to be ... So to me, the fear is often less about the impact on the individuals concerned in a particular issue internally within an organisation, and more about optics and the way in which things play externally. And if you look at some of the cases that have been successful recently, a lot of the discussion in the judgments has been around a perception that has emerged very quickly around a particular case, that if we aren't seen, I think, externally to be stamping on this or dealing with this in a certain way, that actually that will impact on our brand or our reputation. And I think that that is all part and parcel of DEI having become much more externally focused than it was when it was first set up. I think people are terrified. I think people fall into two camps around this. They're either quite, ideologically driven and very kind of fixed stare, very fixed ideas about what DEI looks like and should look like, or they're fearful and they don't even want to have the conversation. That again comes back to why this conversation was so refreshing, I think, because it was neither of those.
Yeah. So I think we've left with that impression that Neil and presumably other people like him will have that same view, that DEI people don't need to know the law. And for you and I, and probably people listening, there's still some big question marks hanging around that. So I'd like to explore that certainly in further episodes. I think that's really worth getting into. Okay, let's move on to the second bit. I think there was another bit that we both picked up on, I think, about this need to escalate things sooner to sort of sensible heads, and the fact reasonableness seems to have gone out of the window. And he mentioned the Lloyds case. Actually, he didn't actually use the word Lloyds. I talked about Lloyds, and then he said in the case that you mentioned. Probably he doesn't want to, directly critique that case. But he said that in that case, he said that's one where, reading it as a professional, I'm sitting thinking, how did you end up where you ended up? And he says, it doesn't feel like the right kind of thinking, and checks and balance had gone on, and there are a whole range of different options, and it comes back to the concept of reasonableness. So I think he was basically saying, why didn't, in an organisation as big as Lloyds Banking Group as well, why on earth did such a big case end up getting that far? And I think that case was kind of around zero tolerance against a very offensive word that was used. And so again, you see where they were going with that, but surely there were points along the line where that could have been stopped, and somebody senior either should have been alerted. Did the senior? I don't know if anybody was ever accountable for that, but something seemed to have gone wrong there. I did think he made one fair point about how we don't hear about the cases where the employer wins in court. We only hear about the cases usually when the employee wins in court. So, there was a point about media bias. I don't want to spend too long thinking about that, but I just thought that was a reasonable point. What did you think about this point about the escalation not happening, and the lack of sort of common sense at some point?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the point about escalation only works if you've got those sensible people to escalate to. And I think if I'm right, and hopefully I'm not right for many organisations, but if I am right that people divide up into ideologues and fearful people on these issues, then where is the sound, calm expertise going to come from? Even if you decide that you need to escalate, what you might find yourself doing is escalating to the very people who've created the culture that's been part of the problem, and therefore you end up in this kind of cycle. I think the Lloyds case was interesting, again, because that definitely came back to perceptions. The tribunal specifically said in the judgment that they suspected that the bank felt that not dismissing the claimant would be condoning use of that word. And there were all these red flags about this case that should have been picked up on, in terms of sound practice, sound employment practice, which is that along the way, people were making very clear statements that they understood that the question that the person was raising, even though they used this really offensive word, the question was a valid one. They understood enough about his style of communication as an individual to understand a bit of that context. They had all of this information to go on, and yet they still decided on this very, very zero tolerance, intolerant response of feeling like there was no option but to get rid of him. I mean, cases often discuss the fact that employers have a kind of band of reasonable responses in any situation. And tribunals are quite reluctant, in my experience, of reading their judgments to impose very specific expectations about this. In this case, you absolutely should have done this. It's more a case of saying, well, there's a kind of range of things that you might have reasonably done in that situation. And what Lloyds was clearly doing here was acting out with that band of reasonable options that were available to it in a case where they really didn't didn't take account of context at all, and just picked up, I think, on this fear of being seen in a certain way. And I mean, this also highlights a lot of issues about external trainers, because that case was all about a training setting where an external company was brought in. There were issues about how the session was managed, and a lot of the Lloyd's response was hinged upon how the external trainer claimed to have responded to the discussion in the room. And
sounds like a terrible, terrible session all round.
I mean, how expensive was that session? I mean, setting aside whatever they paid for that trainer to come in. I mean, it was
cost them £1 million, the whole thing in the end.
Yeah.
Disaster. Yeah. All right. And I think also, I mean, I didn't get a chance to ask Neil. I'm sure that it was a little bit rushed for various reasons at the end of that conversation, but I think he would have, I don't know, I think it was worth making the point that when people make bad decisions in this, it can end up costing people years of their lives and huge stress for everybody. The emotional toll of going through an employment tribunal, and then if there's an appeal and an appeal on the appeal, I mean, we know there have been such high-profile cases of people that have gone back and back to court, all of that time, all of that money, but that stress as well, the emotional toll. And I can imagine for people hearing this, to breezily say, oh, they don't need to know the law, or, decisions need to be around reasonable. So I just think it's worth acknowledging that. And I didn't get a chance to ask Neil about that. So I just wanted to make that point now. Regarding the results of the employment tribunals, I asked him whether he thought people were paying attention in-house to the results of these employment tribunals. He seemed to feel confident at Severn Trent, and I'm sure he's right at Severn Trent, that people were paying attention. He said people will be paying attention. My teams will be paying attention. They'll be looking at whether they need to adapt. But he said most organisations of any size will have employment lawyers who provide a case law briefing to them on a regular basis. So they will... So they'll see those and they'll see the implications of those. Okay. And then he said that what they should be doing is not necessarily, he said, I think where it's interesting for people like myself and people in D&I roles, it's not necessarily in the case law, but in the reading of the case itself and reflecting back. Could I see that happening here? Because the case law will be determined by lawyers and what that means in terms of policy. But I think... where they're great is when you read them and you go, I could see that happening here. So what do I need to do differently to make sure that doesn't happen here? And I put in brackets on this, I put in the margin, yes, in huge letters, because I was like, that's exactly it. Could I see that happening here? What do I need to do differently to make sure that doesn't happen here? I feel like whenever these cases come out, that's what everybody should be sitting down thinking, oh God, could that happen here? Do you think that's true?
True that's what they should be doing. I mean,
yeah,
absolutely.
But they're not.
He was spot on. Whether they're doing that or not, I mean, they might be at Severn Trent. So,
yeah.
But I guess in my experience, I think he's right to talk about the role of lawyers, because I think lawyers do often have a specific remit and a quite solid, calm approach to understanding what's happening in the courts and tribunals. And the part of the problem, though, is that in-house legal teams are often under-resourced. I'm not necessarily talking about the corporate sector here, but certainly in a university that can be a really big organisation. Some universities have 8,000 staff. You might have a couple of in-house lawyers, if that. and they might have a contract for some external legal advice, which they're reluctant to use because it's quite expensive to use, but they absolutely dip into that when they can. Now, the idea that, and of course, these in-house lawyers are looking not just at employment issues, certainly not just at discrimination, but they're looking at the whole breadth of what that organisation is doing in terms of service provision, education provision, running facilities, everything. So the idea, so even if it's a high profile case for those people who are in the know, I feel like it will be one part of what they're looking at. Then I think there's also this issue that when you have EDI teams, and universities, as an example, generally have much bigger EDI teams than in-house legal teams, there's a sense that, well, we've got an EDI team or a DEI team. So why would we need to be briefing a specialist team on cases that they're obviously going to be picking up on? And I think then it comes down to how are DEI teams picking up on these cases. And I think they are aware of them, but they are frustrated by them. They are excluding them. They're filtering them out in a way that is, how do we work around these judgments? How do we ignore them? How do we sideline them? How do we avoid people taking them too seriously? That's the perspective of the DEI team. So you've got this tension, I think, between a legal team that doesn't have the resource to look at these things necessarily, and a DEI team that's actively trying to sideline.
I wonder also, I wonder if there's a bit of face saving as well, that people sort of don't want to admit when they're out of their depth with the law. I mean, I heard somebody say to me about they kind of go with, because they sort of know the law, but they sort of know the law, and so they end up going with what feels legal. That was a DEI person said that to me, and I said, oh, you go with what feels. I mean, what on earth does that mean?
Legal? That's? I mean, I kind of get that in a way, because I feel like if you're not steeped in the law, then you're kind of talking about legal concepts without really knowing what you're talking about. And then it comes down to individual takes on things.
Okay, so he said some quite interesting things about staff networks as well. And again, I think we need a whole episode to talk about staff networks, because I think it's a big part of the picture here. He seemed to be saying that they started off as a way to sort of not seem patronising towards certain groups, and to make sure that the information you're getting about certain groups of employees was correct, rather than particularly white men telling everybody what they need or don't need. So he was sort of saying they started as a kind of little consultancy groups. But then he said the difficulty is that if it gets into, then it starts determining what your policy should be, or what your processes should be, or how they should be, or starting to step beyond that kind of support, then I think that's problematic. And then he said, I think when it gets into internal campaigning for change, and this is what you've seen in a couple of high-profile organisations where they've ended up being pitted against their workforce, then that's problematic, and that is definitely mission creep. I thought that was really interesting, what he said. He's obviously aware there's a problem there, and the mission creep is definitely something to watch, definitely something that's been allowed to get a little bit out of control, I would say. What was your response to that?
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether he was... From my point of view, these networks started as support networks largely. Around the mid-noughties, organisations started to form networks to leave people, to ensure that people weren't sort of feeling isolated within organisations. And so I don't know whether he saw that bit of the process, or whether he knows that that's there. But they did quickly become sort of consultative fora. So, employers and service providers started to realise they had these kinds of ready-made consultative groups. But I agree with him about, once you then start to centre those groups in a policy-making, decision-making function, that's a problem. But the problem is bigger than that, actually. The problem is that these are exclusive groups now. They are ideologically skewed. They are excluding people with views that don't align. We saw this with the recent case Pitt and Cambridgeshire County Council, where that case really centred on the experience of a lesbian in the LGBTQIA plus network, in a meeting of that network, and the response to her expressed views around what it means to be a lesbian and a woman in the context of that group. Now, to my mind, once you have a group that only accepts a certain perspective and excludes not just calm, rational views that contradict that, but also legally protected views, then what you've got is a really... And then you involve that group in policy making. That's the issue. If that group was genuinely diverse, involving it in policy making would be much less of a problem.
Neil said some really interesting stuff also about external training and sort of the lack of quality control around that. I wasn't that surprised to hear there was no quality control because I think we already established that. But he did sort of seem to say that, look, an entire industry sprung up very, very quickly with, not his word, but a whole load of chancellors and grifters. He seemed to be sort of saying, I read between the lines, he said there's a whole industry of leadership and management training that's going on with very little evidence of showing any sort of organisational improvement on the back of it. I think that what you saw here was a lot of people, a lot of sole traders, a lot of small organisations pivoted overnight to suddenly becoming specialists on diversity and inclusion training without any real track record. So he's saying, he's blaming them, but he's also saying that there was a big demand. So he said, and you saw a lot of organisations panicking and thinking, oh my God, we've got to go out and we've got to procure something really, really quickly, but not being clear about what they wanted to get from it and what they wanted to achieve from it and how they were going to measure it and why it was important. So I thought that was really interesting that he was like, I mean, you know, we know that there are all sorts of chancellors with all sorts of dodgy training, but I thought he definitely took some of the blame back onto employers and saying, hang on a minute, a lot of us panicked. A lot of people were desperately looking for something, and that was part of the problem. So I think, and then he said also, he then talked about how it's up to the employer to do the quality control, given that there isn't really any, we know that, it was up to the employer. Does it mean, so he said, is there any quality assurance? No. Does that mean people are necessarily bad? No. Does it mean that the responsibility is on the procurer to be really clear what they want, what they don't want, and what's going to work in your organisation and measure it? Yes. So I thought that was pretty fair and pretty reasonable of him to make that point. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic kind of buyer beware message, and I think he's spot on that the onus is on the organisation to bring in the right people and the right expertise. I guess I would add a kind of supplementary point that I'm not sure that the good people are out there in sufficient numbers to meet the demand. So then you have a situation where even if employers and organisations are doing the right thing to try and get the right kinds of training in, does the right training exist? And yeah, I think that, I mean, we've always had a need to be careful about buying inequalities training. Now, I think the questions should be, okay, how does a trainer grapple with the complexities of the conflict between different rights, largely around, you know, protections around religion or belief and philosophical beliefs. How do we actually ensure that when these issues come up, as they inevitably will in the training session, that the trainers that they're using are confident and clear and not getting the organisation into difficult legal waters? Now, if you're not asking those kinds of questions, if you're just assuming that a track record in EDI speaks for itself for a training company, then you're going to bring in any problems that training company wishes to, you know, throw your way as an organisation. So I think he's spot on. It is buyer beware.
Okay, the last thing I wanted to pull out was what Neil had to say about the government's Inclusion at Work report, which came out in the spring this year. And what he seemed to be saying, it seemed to be an admission. What I heard was an admission that basically the DEI industry didn't read it, didn't engage with it, because it was created under a Tory government and because Kemi Badenoch became so linked to it. He didn't say her name, and he didn't say Conservative or Tory, but I think that's what he was saying. So he said, I think in a lot of cases it was written off without people actually reading the content of the report itself because it was associated with a particular person and a particular regime. He then went on to actually to call the report pretty common sense. But I thought that was a startling admission. I mean, he'd read it, and I'm sure people at Severn Trent had read it, but I thought that was a startling admission that we're saying that people are just not reading stuff because it comes from a government that they didn't vote for, and one of the people promoting it is someone that they don't really like. Actually, Kemi Badenoch wasn't involved in the report itself, but I think she did launch it at an event, and I think she used the word snake oil to describe DEI during that launch event, which I'm not sure was the best move if she wanted to get people to read it. People that need to read it are going to be put off by that. So, you know, whatever we think of that, though, I think that was a startling admission that you've got a very, very good report, I thought. Only 40 pages, and it's all about your industry. Why the hell haven't you read it? What were your thoughts? You've read it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sign of very incurious times. If DEI practitioners aren't poised, ready to grab a report like that and really engage with what it's saying, even if you don't agree with all of it, just really kind of grappling with the nuance. What are you doing? You know, and I think what people would do, they instead of being poised to read it, they were poised to reject it, and that's. When I read it, it seemed to me, just like Neil said, it seems like a really sensible set of guiding principles for moving DEI forward. It wasn't about throwing everything out. It was about separating out good practice from practice that actually only comes back to bite the employer or service provider. So why wouldn't you be engaging with that? But I guess it's a sign of our polarised times that people are making these very snap judgments about actually personalities and individuals, and once you're on the wrong side of that, anything you're linked with is tarnished. That's that sense of guilt by association, isn't it?
Well, that's fair enough if it's in your private life and your personal time, but if it's your job, then I just think there's no excuse for people not reading that report. I thought that was really damning.
Yeah, I wasn't defending that, by the way. I think that sense of polarization, I think, is really bad. I think it's getting us to a point where we're not engaging with ideas anymore. And for me, DEI has always, or should always, be about ideas, and it should be about an openness to listen to different perspectives. I mean, God, sometimes I find, these things are so basic. Having to say that diversity should be about diverse ideas just feels like a tautology. I mean, it's just nonsense, isn't it, to have to spell that out? But I think we're in that territory of needing to spell that out.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, this is all going to run and run, but I think that was a really good conversation with Neil, and I really appreciate you spending some time to help me to dig into some of the bits that set our alarm bells off and were particularly interesting. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we'll see you again soon.
A real pleasure.